For loops are fine when you know how many times you want a loop to execute. But there are some occasions when you might not know at the time you write your program how long a certain operation has to go on for, how many times it has to execute. For example, if you are downloading a file across the internet, you might not know how big the file is. So you don't know in advance that you have 100 lines to download. It might be 1,000. Or, for example, a screensaver. If you're running a screensaver that terminates when somebody presses a key or a mouse button, you don't know how many times you need to run it because you don't know at which point somebody's going to press that button. Now here's a simple example. It's the loops project. Now in this case, it's fairly easy for me to determine how many times I have to do something because I've already put the text into the memo box here, and my task in this program is to copy it one line at a time into the list box on the right here. So this is just for the purpose of showing you the syntax of the three loops. I'll start with the for copy. This by now should look quite familiar. It's a for loop that just counts through an index value, so I've set up I as an integer, and this executes while I is 0 and until it is lines.count -1. Let me explain what that means. The memo is indexed from 0 upwards. That is, the first line in the memo is at index 0 of the memo. That's the way that the memo works. And its count, the lines.count property, returns the total number of lines in memo. So why have I taken one away from that? Well, if there's 100 lines in the memo, the count is 100. But remember, the first line is 0, not 1. So if I were to count all the lines one by one, index 0 would return the first line, index 1 would return the second line, and so on. If I've got 100 lines, then index 99 returns the 100th line. As a result, I have to take 1 from the total count in order to get the index of the last line. And then the code here just copies that line from the line at index I on each iteration through the loop into the list box. Now let's look at the next loop. This is a while copy. Now the syntax of while is while some sort of test do, and then I can execute the code between the begin and the end keywords. In this case, my test is while memo.lines.count is greater than I. And because of the way that the count is indexed, that loop will execute as long as there are more memo lines to be processed. So while there are more memo lines to be processed, I copy from the memo one line at a time into the list box, and I just increment the value of I. Now the repeat loop. The repeat syntax is repeat, and then a certain number of code lines can go, as many as you want, until you come to the keyword until. And with a repeat loop, the test comes at the end. So the repeat loop exits when that test becomes true. In this case, when I is equal to the count of the lines in the memo, the loop exits. The fundamental difference between a while loop and a repeat loop is that a while loop may never execute in some circumstances. If the test in the while loop evaluates to false right away, so if memo lines count is greater than I on the very first time that test is evaluated, the code between begin and end will never be executed. But with repeat, the code between repeat and until always runs the first time because there's no test right at the top. So it always runs, and then the test is evaluated right at the end. Now let's look at this. These three loops may seem to be doing exactly the same thing. The for copy, the while copy, the repeat copy, they all copy the text. And similarly, if I have no text, they all work fine. But in fact, to get the repeat loop to work in that circumstance, when there's no text, I've had to put in an extra line up here. So I deliberately check to see if there's no text in memo 1, that is, if the count is 0, before I execute the repeat loop. And why have I done that? Well, let's see. If I don't put that test in, and now I run it again. Now this time, repeat as before works fine if there's text in memo 1. But what happens if there is no text? So let's try it this time, and oops, my program has crashed. You see, it's not responding to anything I do. So why is that? Let's stop it, press this big red button up here. Now I'm going to be putting a breakpoint just by clicking here. Breakpoint will stop when I'm debugging, and so this puts it into debugging mode when I run it. Let's again select all and delete it and do repeat again. So remember, memo lines count will return 0 now because there are 0 lines in there. So what's the value of I? I equals 1. That's because the repeat loop has executed once. It always executes once, and it's incremented I by 1. So I, the first time it's ever tested, is 1. But the test is until I equals memo1.lines.count, and that's 0. So that evaluates to false. That means that the loop runs again. So continue debugging, and the second time through the loop it's been incremented again, so it's 2. So I is keeping on going up. It's incrementing every time through the loop. And since the test is that it's got to equal 0, because there are 0 lines in the memo, that loop will go on forever. Its test will never evaluate to true. So that's why having this if test, if not memo1.lines.count equals 0, to prevent that happening, has been put in, and that's vital in this circumstance. This is a syntax summary of the loops we've used so far. For loop. For integer variable, and that could be such as I equals start value, and that might be something like 0 or 1, to end value, and that could be some upper range, such as 10 or 100. Do, and then optionally begin and end if you want to enclose a number of lines to be executed in the loop. A repeat loop. Repeat, and then one or more lines to be repeated until, and then a condition that has to evaluate to true. And when it evaluates to true, the repeat loop exits. As long as the condition is false, the repeat loop continues. While. While, a condition that must be true, do, then optionally begin and end, and the code to be repeated while the condition remains true. When the condition evaluates to false, the while loop exits. Finally, there's another example program you might want to have a look at. It's the washer project, and it's a sort of a virtual washing machine application that has various spin cycles and washes. And it just animates a little circle to simulate a washing machine in motion. And there's just a few examples that you might want to look at here of for loops and repeat loops and while not. Now there's one thing to bear in mind when you're doing this, that this was originally written for Windows, and I've used the get tick count function up here, which is an operating system function, and also application process messages, to allow some time for the graphics to update to simulate the washing machine. Now, this is normally found in the Windows unit, but for cross-platform development, the LCL INTF unit provides this function instead. And when I've used it, it doesn't seem to work in quite the same way on the Mac as on Windows, and it may be different on Linux. I haven't tried that. But that's not important. You'll just see a slightly different effect in the animation. So I'll just show you what you see. So you run the program, and this is on Windows. And when I do the simple wash, it counts through the cycle and it animates the circle, and wash and spin, it does a different sort of cycle. And you can look at the code to see how this works. On the Mac, the delay that I've put in with get tick count doesn't seem to allow enough time for the animation to update properly. But that's not really of any significance. The point of this code is to illustrate the various types of loop. So just look through this as a sort of a fun application to illustrate the use of different types of loop that you can use in Pascal.